Welcome to Levels Baptist Church. Joy and a privilege to have each and every one of you here with all of us here to be together in God's house. We started on this sermon of Stephen's a couple of weeks ago before Mother's Day, and we had the break for Mother's Day, and we're back at it today. And so a little bit of this will be sort of a recap, a reminder of what was said 2 weeks ago. We're looking at Stephen, this man who was one of the 7 chosen from among those who were all these brand new believers, this brand new thing. The body of Christ has just come into existence. The church has just begun, and we see that he's been chosen from among those earliest believers to be a man that would serve. He was both a servant and apparently he was also a preacher. And so what we have here, mostly in chapter 7, is kind of a sermon. It's his defense. It's his witness and testimony for himself as he's in the presence of the Sanhedrin. He's been accused of, indicted for various offenses. And so we looked at this to start with a little bit, like I said, a couple of weeks ago. And this study of this person, Stephen, he was this a great man, and he gives us a great sermon, and it's kind of a model for you and I to see how we can also defend our faith. We know that, just a quick reminder, you remember those 40 days between the time Jesus rose back unto life, the resurrection, and his ascension. It was almost like a university time where Jesus spent I believe, a great deal of time, and the example is the road to Emmaus, the 2, where he shared, and it says specifically that he went through the law and the prophets, the testimonies, the writings. And in other words, he went through the Old Testament. In other words, Jesus explaining to his followers, those first earliest believers, where every single word throughout the entire Old Testament was pertaining to Jesus himself, that he was that prophet, and we'll say that again later. So Stephen has tapped into that material. Stephen is now one of those learned. He is now one of those with this great level of intelligence, this new level of understanding as to what the Old Testament is all about. It's about Jesus Christ. So he's this learned, biblical scholar, just a regular guy, so I don't want to build him up too high. It's not some kind of a person that you and I can't achieve the same level of understanding. We also can be like Stephen. We can be wonderful, godly people. We can be Christians. We can serve, and we can defend our faith. So he's a good model for us. And we can also have the same understanding that Jesus explained in those 40 days, how it is that the Old Testament spoke of him, Jesus, as Messiah. So we've got Stephen in the presence of the Supreme Court of Israel, the Sanhedrin. He's come under attack, and he responds very boldly, right there in the face of persecution. He's on trial, and he just says, okay, so be it, I'm here, I'm going to take advantage of my opportunity. Well, it starts in Acts 7:1, where first the high priest, he says, are these things so? Well, what is he talking about? Back up to Acts 6, look at verses 11 and 13. Then they suborned men which said, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God, and set up false witnesses which said, this man ceases not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. And really what it boiled down to, what they were trying to say, this is almost a situation where they picked the 4 most important things to them, and they said, he has spoken against all 4 of them. In other words, they're throwing the book at it. This is the worst way of condemning a person that you could ever possibly come up with. And he has messed up severely. He has broken every one of these things. So they're mad, they're upset. They've got him here in the Sanhedrin. He's there all by himself. He's no attorney, no lawyer. He's defending himself. And he says, okay, fine, I'm good with that. I'll stand before you and I will give you the truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ that I have seen with my own eyes and I've learned from the Old Testament. Well, if you remember, we talked about this thing where anytime there's an argument, you can tell when one side or the other starts to lose, because instead of just continuing to defend their position, they start name-calling or belittling or something like that, or wanting to fight. And that's how this began. Stephen was in a synagogue. He was winning the argument. They started calling him names, and they drug him down to the Sanhedrin. And so it's all name-calling. It's because they can't defend their position, and obviously Stephen could. He could defend his position, and he did so very thoroughly. Last time, again, we started in chapter 7. We got through somewhere around verse 16. And so we're not going to rehash all of that word for word, but we'll just see how far we get through the rest of the chapter, through the rest of his sermon. I want to remind you that, again, the church, the body of Christ, this is a brand new system in the world, right? Jesus Christ just died within weeks prior to this event of Stephen standing here in the Sanhedrin in this court setting. Jesus just died, just rose back from the grave, just ascended. Again, we're talking less than 2 months, maybe 2 months, but somewhere along there, all of this is fresh. All of this is brand new, at least the way I understand the timing. I could be off a week or 2 or a month, but it's very, very soon. And the reason I point that out is because this group, known as the Sanhedrin, these are the same guys that were out to get Jesus. These are the same guys that went to Pilate, went to Herod, and insisted that Jesus be taken out because they were done with him. They were bugged by him, and they didn't want him around. They didn't like his message. Well, they thought, okay, great. We've killed this guy, Jesus, so he's out of our hair. No, they just made it 100,000 times worse by killing Jesus because he was raised back unto life, and now this whole thing has begun. And the new saved born-again believers are growing by the thousands. Peter preaches once, 3,000 saved. Peter preaches a second time, 5,000 more are saved. So all they did was just open up something to let all this go forward. And rather than there being one Jesus preaching and starting this thing, well, now there's hundreds, now there's thousands, now there's all of these followers, and they're just... they're all over the city of Jerusalem, and they're just spreading the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ like crazy. So they're beside themselves. This Sanhedrin, this group, they're so upset, they're so mad, they can't believe this is happening. They just simply want it to go away. But the church, regardless of how much they've been persecuted, they persevere, and they just work that much harder, and they're sharing the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ that much more boldly. They say Jesus is the Christ, the Savior. He's provided redemption. And now, by you killing him, and now by you continuing to persecute the rest of us, you're just forcing us to grow even more boldly day in and day out. And of course, they didn't have their own meeting place, a church like we have here. They just met wherever they could, people's homes, but sometimes in what they call Solomon's porch there around the temple. So, they preach, and they preach hard, and they're preaching Jesus Christ, and they are very powerful, and they're faithful. And again, the numbers just keep growing and growing and growing. They're driving the Sanhedrin crazy, and they've got Stephen. Well, we told you last time, and again, I'm just going to touch on these, but maybe I'll just go ahead and get this out of the way, let the cat out of the bag, as they say. What happens in this sermon in chapter 7 is 1, 2, 3, repeat. 1, 2, 3, repeat. 1, 2, 3, repeat. 1, 2, 3, repeat. And each time it's for God, then it's for Moses, then it's for the law, then it's for the temple. Does everybody see what I'm talking about looking at the screen there? So he convinced them to listen about God. He defended himself about God. He accused his accusers about God, and then the same holds true for Moses, the law, and the temple. Everybody follow what I'm saying there in that regard? So unless you want to stay to about 2 or 3, we probably won't get to all 4 of those. We'll probably just try to do God and maybe Moses. Well, since we did God last time, hopefully we get Moses. But anyway, we're probably not going to do the whole chapter and get through all 4 of those. Again, it's a pattern. It just keeps repeating. It's Stephen standing boldly before the Sanhedrin, and he's flipping the script. He's saying, no, you guys got this whole thing backwards. I'm not the blasphemer, you are. And so, first, the way that he convinces them to listen, if you remember, I told you, how is it that you get a conversation going with someone even if you know maybe they're your enemy, maybe they don't care for you, the first thing you do is you figure out, what do we have in common? What can we talk about to get the ball rolling that we both know that we agree upon? Stephen does an excellent job at that. He turns immediately to the Old Testament, immediately to the story of Abraham. He gets the ball rolling by talking about Abraham and the promises that God made to Abraham. And when he does that, he grips their attention. He has their ears opened by doing that. He says, hey, we're in agreement. Abraham was a man of God. Okay? Abraham was a great guy that answered the call of God. And so he gets their attention. He gets them to listen. Then he starts to defend himself. And then, obviously, the third step, he accuses his accusers. He flips that script. He indicts them. Which, think about how bold that is. There's at least 70 of them in the Sanhedrin, these actual, religious elite guys that are supposed to be the most learned in all of the land. But beyond that, remember the ones that dragged Stephen there, those accusers. Remember those from the synagogue. Remember, they recruited some liars to come along. Liars is not in the Bible. That's the word I just flew out of my mouth. But they drug some other people to come along with them to help you. Hey, you got to help build this case against this guy. We're throwing a book at him, so we need you to throw some extra stuff in there. So there's all these people in this room, all against one man, Stephen. And he said, that's okay. I'm not here by myself. I'm here with God. Well, I won't have time to say this later, so I'm going to say it now. What Stephen does at the very end of this sermon, the very last thing he does is he says, oh, by the way, you are the guys that killed Jesus Christ. It's your fault. You did it. So that's going to come at the very end of the chapter. We won't get there today, but I wanted to make sure you all know that's coming. He's bold enough to say that in the end. And sadly, that's what triggers them. That's what pushes them over the edge, which forced them to, in their minds, think that they're in a position where they had no other choice but to physically force him over the edge. They threw him off a cliff and they killed him. So, we're looking at this biblical defense, these words that Stephen is speaking, this sermon, as he defends his position. And he gives us a glimpse of his tremendous knowledge of the Old Testament in the process. He doesn't get anything wrong. We're not going to read every single word of this chapter and talk about every single minute detail. I encourage you to do that on your own time, but he never gets anything wrong. So look now, Acts 7 verse 1, we see where the high priest opens things up. He says, okay, I'm going to give you a chance to speak. What do you have to say for yourself? Is it true that you have blasphemed God, Moses, the law of the temple? And verse 2 says, and he said, men, brethren, fathers, hearken, the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. So remember what I said. He's trying to grip them. He's trying to convince them to listen. He's trying to convince them to get on the same page with him. And he does that by reminding them. The language that he uses here is not by accident. Men, brethren, fathers, hearken. None of that's by accident. He's reminding them, hey, first of all, guys, I'm one of you. I am a Jew. I've got Abraham's blood coursing through my veins. We're brothers. He's very respectful. But he's trying to get them to calm down a little bit and open their ears and listen. So he does that very well. Remember, they're worked up. They're mad. They're sick of this whole Jesus movement that's taken over the city. This big crowd, Stephen's there by himself. And the first title that he gives God, and this is the only place it's used anywhere in the Bible, Stephen calls in verse 2, he calls God the God of glory. The God of glory, well, if he was a blasphemer, he wouldn't pay such a strong compliment to God. He wouldn't use those words. Now you might say, oh, well, if he was just a good liar, he might. Okay, well, maybe so. But then he follows it up with all the great level of knowledge. And so he talks about Abraham. Skip down to verse 8. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac and circumcised him the 8th day. And Isaac begat Jacob. And Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. In other words, Stephen knows the history of the Jewish faith very well. And he knows the Old Testament very well. And he's still just trying to get their attention, just trying to tie them in to his word to say, we're brothers. Abraham is my father just like he's your father. His blood courses through my veins. And God set something in motion. God chose Abraham to begin something. And he made a promise to Abraham. And what we see in verse 8 is how things developed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. And then Jacob gave birth to the 12. The big 12. Okay? So he's recognizing all of that and how God was the one to bring that about. God was the one that put that into motion. Well, who was one of the 12? A guy named Joseph. And again, we covered some of this before, so I'm running through this quickly here. Look at verse 15, Acts 7:15. So Jacob went down into Egypt and died, he and our father. So I'm cutting through some of the story, but you know the story. You know how Joseph was sold into slavery, and he goes down to Egypt, so he's the first one there, and he's in jail for a long time, and eventually he rises to power. Well, the people back in Israel, Jacob and the other sons, they start getting really hungry, and they go seeking out of desperation, and they wind up at the feet of Joseph, and at first they don't even know it's him, but nonetheless, the point of what Stephen's trying to do here is he's trying to remind the Sanhedrin as to how all of this got kicked off, how all of this started. Joseph was rejected. He was chosen by God to be the one to deliver God's people. And he would eventually do that. But he was rejected first, sold into slavery, went down to Egypt, did all this stuff. They just assumed he was dead, gone. They'd never see him again. But what's he wind up doing? He winds up delivering them. They come down to Egypt, which is what we just read in verse 15. They go down to Egypt, but what happens? Sadly, they spend so much time there, a grand total of 400 years when it's all said and done, they die there. They don't ever even go back home to Israel. They've been delivered. They've been saved by Joseph after they first rejected him. So what Stephen's doing, and he does it every time with all four of these, God moves the law in the temple, every time he says, God sent you a deliverer. God sent someone. It was His plan, and you rejected God's plan. And the beautiful thing about the way he does that, first of all, he's right. He quotes the Old Testament. He knows exactly what he's saying. But he just keeps harping on this idea that those people who were supposedly the people of God were rejecting God's plan. And he keeps saying that over and over and over again to the point to where he's bringing them to the conclusion, you've done it again. You rejected Jesus Christ. So you did it once with Joseph. We'll see in a moment where they did it with Moses, the law of the temple. It's you doing this. You're the one that does it, this blaspheming God. Not me. You're blaspheming God because it's your heritage. It's your history where you're constantly rejecting God and God's way of doing things. Well, there's a lesson in that for you and I today. God has a plan. And it is not God's job to get on our boat and follow our plans and our designs, right? That's backwards. God has a plan, and rather than you and I rejecting what that plan is, the way these people did, that Stephen keeps saying it over and over again, you rejected God's plan. Well, you and I today have the same ability to either choose to reject God's plan or to choose to get on board with God's plan. So it was not Stephen who had blasphemed God. On the contrary, he was open. He received the Messiah. He didn't reject him. He was open. He received him. Thereby, it was those Sanhedrin, those who had put Jesus to death, they had rejected God's plan. They had blasphemed God. So, here we go, all over again. Number one, number two, number three, except this time for Moses. He goes right back to the Old Testament. He goes right back to the story that they all knew and loved. And, obviously Joseph was a hero of the faith. Moses, hero of the faith. Abraham, hero of the faith. He once again, he said, okay guys, relax, calm down, listen to me. We're on the same boat. And he goes to the story of Moses. He goes right to the Old Testament. Again, he goes through it perfectly. He knows it very well. He doesn't tell any lies. And he goes exactly to the place where he knows he can grip their attention and get them to listen and say, hey, we got this in common. Moses was your hero. He was my hero also. He was a great guy. He did a lot of really good stuff. He followed God's plan. Look now at Acts 7, verse 17. But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. So again, this is following along with the story. Jacob has the 12. Joseph is the first one to go down. He rises up to come into power. The Jacob and their other sons are starving in Israel, so they come down. Well, when they move down there, they're delivered, but it's temporary, right? They wind up staying there, and they grow and grow and grow and grow to the point that some people believe they might have been as many as 2 million Jews. But none of them have seen Abraham's promise fulfilled yet. There's a lot of them. 2 million, that's a big number if that's right. There's a bunch of them. They're growing. They're having babies like crazy. But none of them are in Israel, the promised land. So the promise of God is still hanging out there, still looming. It's coming, but it has not come yet. And by the way, the Abrahamic covenant, that's Genesis chapter 12, where God tells Abraham, your descendants will be like numbering the sands of the sea, stars in the heaven, and so forth and so on, including the promised land. So again, they're growing, but they haven't made it. Well, we know they didn't make it, right? Those 12 died in Egypt. That's what that verse said that we just read. They never saw the promise fulfilled. God told them, it was a prediction. He told them, he let them know in advance, your descendants will be aliens in a foreign land. They'll be enslaved. They'll be mistreated. And he even told them for 400 years. That's in Genesis 15. And as with God, in any time that he predicts anything, it always happens just exactly the way that he says it would. They're strangers. They're exiles. All of those 12 died in Egypt and never saw the promised land. The fulfillment of it all belonging to them as their kingdom. So, all of their relatives, all of their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, for 400 years they're in Egypt. They're growing up there. They're learning Egyptian ways. But eventually, sadly, they get so big, so massive that the new Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph all of a sudden starts getting worried. Look at verse 18. Till another king arose which knew not Joseph. You know the story. You know how this happens. The new Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. He feels threatened by them, so he turns them, all the Jews, into slaves. Look at Acts 7, verse 19. The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our family, so that they cast out their young children to the end they may not live. So a part of what they did to try to control the population, to try to slow it down, is they threw the male children, this is Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, throw the boys into the river, drown them. We don't want them growing any further. Well, God's in charge, so he's got another plan. Acts 7, verse 20, in which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. Again, we're very familiar with this story. Stephen knows it well. He's just simply quoting back to the Sanhedrin. We're on the same page, guys. Moses, he's a hero of the faith. He's my hero. He's your hero. And he's just running down through it, just ticking off the boxes. Yep, Moses was born. He was one of the boys cast into the river, except he had something under him that would float. And the Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out and decides to make him her son. So you know all the story. You know how Moses is raised by his own mother, and she gets paid by Pharaoh to raise her own son Moses. Right? Isn't that a beautiful thing, how God works that out? When it's God's plan and it's God's will, God will supply the means necessary to pay for it. That's just plain and simple. That's the way God works. So, Stephen says everything positive about Moses, nothing negative. He doesn't lie, but stop and think about that for just a second. Can you constantly brag about anybody you know and never say anything negative? It's almost impossible, because they're human and there's something probably negative about them at some point in time or other. Well, What is he doing? He's on trial. He's trying to defend himself. He's trying to convince them, no, I'm not a blasphemer of Moses. So he tells them all this good stuff, which was all true. He just never included any of the negative things. Now this is not an excuse to try to build Moses up to make him bigger, more important, or even perfect, because we know he's a human being and he was not perfect. Anyway, so what happens, you know the story. Moses grows up in the house of Pharaoh. He's got all of the plush luxuries of being a prince, and all the money paying for all of his education, and all of the everything about life is going perfect for Moses throughout those 40 years. Well, again, the Jews have been turned into slaves. The baby boys are getting thrown into the water, and the Pharaoh is upset with them because they're growing so quickly, and he's afraid that they're going to overtake him. Acts 7:24. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him. We're talking about Moses. Moses sees one of his brothers, talking about a Hebrew slave, suffering wrong. He defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. So this is the prince Moses coming into a situation where there is an Egyptian taskmaster beating up or whatever. He's abusing one of the Hebrew slaves. Moses steps in and kills the Egyptian taskmaster. It's an ugly situation. It's murder, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, it's as if Moses knows. It's as if he understands that God has called him. God's plan for his life is that he be a deliverer of the Hebrew slaves. What does a deliverer do? He delivers. He steps in at this point in time to help out one of his Hebrew brothers. Look at verse 25. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. So here we have it all over again. Just like Joseph, where Joseph's brother, Joseph knew he had been called by God to deliver his people, but the brothers, and even the dad for that matter, Jacob, said, man, don't tell me about those dreams anymore, because that's belittling. We don't want to hear that stuff. Here we go again, where God's people, the actual Hebrew slaves, they're telling the defender, the deliverer that was sent by God, they're telling Moses, thanks but no thanks. We're not interested. We don't want you to deliver us. That was God's plan, and they rejected it. So here, this is just the second one. Stephen's defending his own life, his own words. He's not the blasphemer of God. He's not the blasphemer of Moses. You Sanhedrin, it's your people. It's your lives that you live, built upon a foundation of those fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers that constantly rejected God's plan. You are the ones who have rebelled. You are the ones that have rejected God and His plan. You all have rejected Joseph and Moses. So the 400 years goes by, and it's time for a deliverer. Moses is the one to do that, and he's rejected. Stephen says, it's not me, it's you, it's your foundation, it's what your whole life is built upon. And just as before in the issue of God, he not only convinces them to listen, defends himself, but he accuses his accusers. He flips the coin. He turns the tables. He says, it wasn't me. I'm not the guy blaspheming God or Moses. It was you all. You did this. Look at verse 26. And the next day he showed himself unto them as he strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another? So this is Moses. This is Stephen describing Moses. Moses comes into the situation, the previous verse where he kills an Egyptian taskmaster to help slave or to deliver a Hebrew slave. Now in this verse, it's two Hebrews fighting with each other. And Moses steps in. Again, he's trying to be a peacemaker. He's trying to deliver them. And how did they respond? Look at 27 and 28. But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? What do you think? Moses wants that broadcast on the news? Do you think he wants that on the front page of the newspaper? Of course not. He killed an Egyptian. It's murder. So what does he do? He's got to get out of there. Just think about this situation where Moses is trying to do what's right. He's trying to resolve an argument between two Hebrew slaves, trying to deliver them, trying to be a peacemaker, and instead he's treated as a criminal, which technically he was. He had murdered someone. Verse 29. Then fled Moses at this saying, was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. So this is just a moving forward in the story of Moses. This is where he began. He was born, put in the bulrushes in the boat, whatever it was. Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out. She raises him, but she does it through Moses' own mother actually raises him and gets paid to do it. And he gets to be 40, and all of a sudden he starts stepping in and say, hey, God sent me to be your deliverer. And they reject him. They don't want no part of it. So he says, okay, I got to get out of here. I'm on the run because I killed an Egyptian. They've rejected me. I'll go build my life somewhere else. So he literally goes out into the desert, out into the wilderness, finds a shepherd, marries his daughter, has 2 boys, starts a life there, and 40 years flies by. So now all those Hebrew slaves are still slaves for 40 more years because they rejected him when he presented himself the first time at the age of 40 as their deliverer. Acts 7 verse 30. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame and fire in a bush. Again, you all know the story. He's out there, he's watching the sheep, doing his job. He's got his wife, his 2 kids. And there is a bush on fire, but it's not consuming the bush. So he goes over there and starts talking to the bush. And, of course, you don't want to do that in front of anybody. They'll think you're crazy. But God tells him, obviously, this is holy. Let's read that. Look at Acts 7. Let's start with 31. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. As he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. Why is that ground holy, anybody?
Because God's there.
Because God is there, period. That's the only reason why the ground was holy. Thank you very much. Verse 34, I have seen the affliction of my people which is in Egypt. I have heard their groaning, and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. God is always faithful. God will make a promise, and then He will fulfill it. He will always fulfill His promises. He will always show up. He will always keep His word. And He tells Moses, you're the one. It's you. I'm sending you back to where you left from because you're the deliverer. You are my plan. You're the one that's going to bring them out. Verse 35. This Moses, whom they refused. Now this verse, don't be confused because I know we're flip-flopping back and forth. But this verse is Stephen. This is Stephen talking, right? He's talking to the Sanhedrin. And he's defending the fact that he's not the one that blasphemed Moses. And he's telling them these words. He says, this move of Moses, whom they refused. So he's reminding them, 40 years earlier, he tried to go to be their deliverer. And they said, no thanks, we're not interested. Who did that? Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. He's flipping it, right? He's accusing his accusers. They refused, saying, who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. So it's not like they rejected him and God said, oh, well, that didn't work, I'll try something else. No. God just says, okay, get out of there for 40 years, go take a break. Meanwhile, you're going to be in the university of the, some call it desert or whatever you want to call it, but now all of a sudden he's got a PhD in the desert, right? Now all of a sudden he knows that like the back of his hand after spending 40 years in there and keeping those sheep. Now that he's ready, he's been prepared by God, now he goes back. Here's his second chance to go to those same Hebrew people, they're just 40 years older, to deliver them. God's plan, God's man. He'd been rejected once, got out, now he's fixing to be sent back. That's not a word, is it? Fixing to be. Look at verse 36. He brought them out. After that, he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. So again, Stephen's reminding them, I know the Old Testament. I know the story of Moses. I'm in full agreement. He was a great guy. Positive. I'm not the one that rejected Moses. I'm not the one that rejected him as deliverer. And of course, you know the story, God parting the Red Sea and so forth and so on. What is Stephen saying? You're out of time. He had shown the Jews that they had consistently throughout their history, over and over and over and over again, they were the blasphemers. They were the one that rejected God's plan through Joseph. They were the one that rejected God's plan through Moses. And again, we don't have time to get to the law of the temple. It's the exact same 3 points. 1, 2, 3. Convince them, listen, defend themselves, accuse his accusers. It's the exact same thing for all of those. It was the Sanhedrin. It was the foundation of their religion that they had built. A religion built on rejection. Rejecting God's plan. You sent Joseph? No thanks. We don't want him. But because God has a plan, and when He makes a plan, it works out. So Joseph was rejected the first time, then he's their deliverer when he feeds them all the second time, when he's elevated to the second in charge of all of Egypt, right? Moses was rejected the first time at 40 years old and spends 40 years getting prepared. In the desert, goes back a second time. Then he's received the second time and he brings the people out. And you know the 10 plagues, you know they come out, you know the Red Sea, the crossing, and you know the rest of the story. What Stephen is reminding the Sanhedrin of, to defend himself, he's saying, it's you all that are the blasphemers of God. It's you all that have constantly rejected. And if you remember, Jesus told a parable in Matthew 21. He says, God sent servants and you beat them. You threw them out. You killed them. Remember Jesus talked about that? Go to verse 37. Acts 7:37. We're almost done. This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me. Him shall ye hear. Who do you think Moses was talking about? Who was God going to bring on the world stage
Jesus.
To deliver? Thank you. The perfect Sunday school answer. If you don't know the answer, just shout Jesus. I want you to turn and read this because I just think this is really powerful. Look at Deuteronomy real fast. We're almost done. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse number 15. Deuteronomy 18:15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee. Where did Jesus come from? He was a Jew that came right out of Israel. Of thy brethren. He was a Jew fully 100%. Abraham's blood coursed through his veins. Like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken. Stephen quoted that verse. We just read it in Acts. What is he doing? He's showing them very clearly. He's walking them through this whole thing step by step. You rejected God's plan in Joseph. You blasphemed God and Moses because he was the deliverer God sent and you rejected him and said, no, thank you. Moses goes back the second time and delivers them. Hear this group, these people, these that are accusing Stephen. He's reminding them of their great level of pride that they have in Joseph and Moses as their deliverers. But he's reminding them that it took a second go around because that first time they rejected God's plan. He's reminding them of that. Now, does any of that sound like it lines up with something else that happened? Somebody that came the first time and got rejected and he's coming again? Does that sound familiar to anybody here? What was the answer a while ago?
Jesus.
Jesus. That's exactly right. This is Stephen trying to make them understand what has been happening over and over and over through Joseph, Moses, the law, and the temple. It has all been brought right there to them. In their day, in their time, the deliverer existed. He was right there before them. And they did the same thing they had done every time before. They rejected him. They killed him. It wasn't Stephen that had blasphemed. It was those in the Jewish faith, the Sanhedrin. Let's bow, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we love you, we praise you, we just thank you, dear Lord, for your great love, grace, and mercy. We thank you for each of these that are here today. We thank you for the message of Stephen and his great boldness, willing to stand and share the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, willing to be a great example and model for those of us today that are living for you. We pray, dear Lord, that you'd empower us, enable us, give us the words just that you gave to Stephen in that day and that time. Help us, dear Lord, to stand boldly in the face of persecution, as I fear it may come sooner than later. Help us, dear Lord, to serve you well, and to never, ever reject you and your plan in any way, shape, or form. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.